Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. We will get started in just a few seconds. Well, hello again. My name is Patricia Julianelle from Schoolhouse Connection. It looks like it's about time for us to get started, so let's go ahead and make good and respectful use of your time today. We are going to spend the next hour talking about some short, sweet, and strategic ARP HCY tools. Of course, ARP HCY being the American Rescue Plan, Homeless Children and Youth Funds. As I said, I'm Patricia Julianelle, Senior Strategist for Program Advancement and Legal Affairs at Schoolhouse Connection. We'll have joining us shortly Eileen Botelho and Stephanie Enos from the Rhode Island Department of Education, and I will let them go ahead and introduce themselves just a few slides from now when we're going to hear directly from them about some of their very innovative ideas for how to support local school districts and charter schools in using their ARP HCY funds. I assume that you're familiar with Schoolhouse Connection since you're here on our webinar today, but in case this is your first SHC webinar, we are a national nonprofit organization working to overcome homelessness through education. We have a number of different programs, including state and federal policy, webinars like this one, implementation tools. We have a Q&A from our inbox feature on our website where you can look up different questions that we've actually received from the field by topic, by keyword, etc. That hopefully will be a good resource. And we want to make sure you know about our Youth Leadership and Scholarship Program. We give out scholarships every year to high school seniors who have experienced homelessness, and then we continue following those students throughout their post-secondary education career and even into the workforce. Many scholars that we've worked with over the years are now in their late 20s, early 30s, have their own families, and it's a real joy to be able to continue knowing them and having relationships and friendships with them over the years. So keep an eye out for that scholarship application when it becomes available. So what we're going to talk about over the next 60 minutes or so, I'm going to give you a quick overview of ARP HCY funds and allowable uses and some of the guidance that we've received from the U.S. Department of Education. Then we're going to hear from our colleagues in Rhode Island about why they thought a needs assessment was important for school districts and charter schools to be able to do as they think about using their funds. We'll give you a quick demonstration of the needs assessment that we developed together with the Rhode Island Department of Education, kind of show you what that looks like and how it works. And then we'll hear again about how it's actually being used in practice in the field. And we will have some time for Q&A for you. Because this is a webinar with quite a few people on it, we won't be doing Q&A live, but we will be taking your Q&A in writing. So you can type your questions into the questions pane or the chat box at any point throughout the entire webinar. And then when we get to questions at the end, I'll be able to just jump into the question pane and chat box and get to your questions then. So feel free to type those in anytime as they occur to you. So let's start with a quick overview of some of the highlights of the ARP Homeless Children and Youth Funding. First thing that we always like to do is just set the stage of why we think this funding is important, why the connection between homelessness and education. And of course, all of you on the webinar today are very well aware of this. We know that homelessness can cause a lot of physical and mental health challenges and problems for students experiencing homelessness because of the trauma and the mobility and the stress of that situation. And that can lead to some really negative educational consequences. The data show that students experiencing homelessness have very high rates of chronic absenteeism, twice the rates of punitive discipline, including suspensions and expulsions, lower graduation rates, and then that gets us into this cycle where the greatest single risk factor for young adult homelessness is the lack of a high school degree. And that was shown in the largest study of youth homelessness that was ever done about going on 6 years ago now by Chapin Hall. So when we get into this cycle of homelessness creating difficulties with graduation and not graduating creating more homelessness, that's where I think it becomes pretty apparent that one way to intervene in this is to help our students access a great education and be able to graduate from high school. So let me go ahead and get some information from you, make this a little bit interactive. I do have a poll for you. I'm interested in how much ARP HCY funding your district is receiving. You might not actually know this information, and that's fine too. But if you can let me know, are you part of a consortium? So you might actually be getting less than 5,000 individually, but your consortium's getting more. 5 to 10,000, 10 to 25, over 25, and maybe you're just not sure. It's a little bit soon in some states. Some districts don't know how much they're getting, or maybe in your position, no one's informed you yet. So thank you for voting. I can see your votes are coming in, and I will give you a few more seconds to let us know how much ARP funding you're getting. And of course, if you're not with a school district or a charter school, you might not know, but you can contact your local school district and ask around. Alrighty, I'm going to give you about 5 more seconds to get your final votes in. Okay, closing the poll now, and let me share the results with you. And it looks like most of you on this call at least are getting over 25,000, but there's a number of people who are part of a consortium. I'm very happy to have you all here. I think in some ways the consortia are heroes because it took an extra step for you to have to actually get the funds. And then we have some other funding amounts as well, and some people who aren't aware, and that's fine too. But it's good to know. That just helps me know how I should be concentrating my remarks in terms of how much money people on this particular call are getting. So thank you for playing and doing the poll with me. So a little bit about the American Rescue Plan, ARP HCY funding. For those of you who don't know, this was a total $800 million appropriation just specifically for children and youth experiencing homelessness. This is the same amount that McKinney-Vento got over the course of an entire decade, and now it is what has been made available through ARP HCY all at once. So it's certainly a big change for McKinney-Vento programs around the country. About 200 million of that went out to local educational agencies through competitive subgrants. So a lot of that funding went to existing McKinney-Vento grantees. But the larger chunk of funds, just about 600 million of it, went out by formula to local educational agencies around the country. The formula was half based on your Title I Part A allocations and half based on numbers of McKinney-Vento students identified. And there was a provision in that funding that for LEAs that would get less than $5,000 under the formula, they were not able to get funding unless they formed consortia to get that amount up over 5,000. And like I said, I'm glad to see that we have some consortium members here on the webinar with us today. Let me go over quickly the allowable uses for ARP HCY funds, and these are not sort of what Schoolhouse Connection thinks you should do with the money. This is actually from the Department of Education in terms of what is legally allowable for this particular pot of funds. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time going over these allowable uses and some other considerations before we jump into the needs assessment piece. And one quick piece of housekeeping I forgot to mention, the handouts are available in the handouts pane of your webinar. If you want to go ahead and download those right now, you can. I know that a lot of times people have trouble accessing handouts through GoToWebinar, so don't fret. Those will be available on our website, and actually you'll get an email to your email inbox today or tomorrow that will have a direct link to get you those handouts. So if you have trouble accessing them now, don't worry, you'll have them later today or tomorrow at the latest. So now let me jump in and share these allowable uses. What the Department of Education has said as kind of a touchstone for all the different uses of funds to keep in mind is that the expenses need to be reasonable and necessary to facilitate the enrollment, enrollment, retention, and educational success of children and youth experiencing homelessness. So that's kind of an overall principle. Anytime you're thinking about using these funds, think about, is it reasonable? So is the cost reasonable compared to other options that you might have available or other resources that you might have available? And is it necessary to facilitate identification or enrollment or retention or success of children and youth experiencing homelessness? So that would include any of the typical McKinney-Vento Act uses. So if you've been a McKinney-Vento grantee in the past, you know that there's a list of 16 allowable uses for your McKinney-Vento funds. Any of those uses are also fine for ARP HCY. In addition, you can use these ARP HCY funds to connect students and families to enrichment programs. You can use them to provide wraparound services. We don't have a specific definition of what wraparound means, but we do have some very helpful information from the Department of Ed in those parentheses. They have suggested that academic supports, trauma-informed care, social emotional support, and mental health services all fall under that category of wraparound services. So we can use our funds to support those needs for students. Needed supplies, some of your typical school hygiene supplies, other items. You can use these funds for transportation to enable children and youth to attend classes and participate fully in school activities. As always, these are for excess transportation costs. So whatever you are providing to students generally through district funds or through other funds, you need to continue to provide that, but you can use your ARP HCY funds for some additional transportation needs or some excess costs. You can also purchase cell phones or other devices to allow you to keep in touch with students and families, and also to allow students to attend and participate fully in school activities. You can pay for short-term temporary housing, and I would definitely point you to that parenthetical. A few days in a motel is the example that the Department of Education has given there. So this doesn't mean, paying first, last month rent or utility bills or ongoing housing. It's really meant to be very short-term and temporary, when that's the only reasonable option for COVID-safe temporary housing and when it's necessary for students to be able to attend school and participate fully in school activities. These funds can specifically be used for store cards or prepaid debit cards to allow students and families to purchase materials they need for school, and also to increase the capacity of the McKinney-Vento program or of the Liaison. One other allowable use for these funds that might be a little bit different than what you're used to if you've been a McKinney-Vento grantee in the past is that both at the state and local level, there's an encouragement to subcontract, to award contracts to community-based organizations, particularly those that are well-positioned to identify and serve children and youth in historically underserved populations. So really trying to think very specifically and very deliberately about who are populations in your community that typically have been affected by structural racism, by inequities that are built into different systems, and that have historically been underserved. So that might include your Native American students, students of color, students with disabilities, English learners, LGBTQ youth, certainly pregnant or parenting students, and definitely paying attention to rural areas. And when we talk about those historically underserved populations, just a quick snapshot, these data are from the National Youth Risk Behavior Survey that's administered around the country in high schools. We were able to take a look at that data and break it down to focus specifically on high school students experiencing homelessness and looking at different ethnic groups, racial groups, and some of our other populations. So you can see this disproportionality is very significant in terms of looking at our Black students and Hispanic students, our Native American students, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and questioning students, and then particularly looking down at the bottom of the slide, transgender students, over 9 times more likely to experience homelessness, and students who are pregnant or had gotten someone pregnant, 10 times more likely to experience homelessness than those without an involvement with a pregnancy. So we know that we definitely need to do some specifically focused outreach to reach many of these populations who are disproportionately represented among our students experiencing homelessness and oftentimes are underserved. A couple of other touchstones about ARP HCY funding. Remember that ARP HCY funds cannot replace funds that are otherwise available or provide services that are otherwise provided. So if you're providing, for example, summer enrichment programs through your ESSER funds, that's fantastic. Don't do that with your ARP HCY funds. What you might do with ARP HCY maybe is provide a device to a student so they can keep in touch with you about those enrichment programs. You might want to provide transportation to get the students to and from those programs if your school or district is not otherwise providing that. But again, don't replace things that are already being provided. If you're giving everybody Chromebooks, don't use your ARP HCY funds for Chromebooks. Use those funds for other things. So that's one thing to keep in mind. I wanted to make sure, talking about not replacing other funding that's available, I wanted to just give you a quick snapshot. The American Rescue Plan had a lot of money for a lot of programs. So if you're interested in helping your students or your parents access childcare, be aware that the child care subsidy program got more than $1 billion extra through ARP. Head Start got extra funding through ARP. Emergency rental assistance programs got extra funding. Technology, E-rate, and other kinds of broadband. So a lot of what you can do with ARP, instead of supplanting these other funds that are out there, you could use your ARP HCY funds maybe for, you know, a part-time social worker to help families navigate all of this funding that's out there already. A lot of this funding is going unused. It's just sitting there. People are not accessing it. It's available. And we know that our families and students need help to be able to access these different programs. So we do have on our website a document that summarizes all of these different funding streams and eligibility requirements for students and families experiencing homelessness. So at the end of this webinar, I'm going to give you the link where you can go and get a lot of information about these programs and other ARP HCY funds. Another thing to keep in mind, and these again are quotes from the Department of Education here, these funds should be supporting the needs of students, including reduced identification. We know that a lot of our McKinney-Vento students disappeared during distance learning, and we haven't been able to get all of them back into the classroom yet. So doing that outreach to find those students, bring them back into school, navigate services like I was just mentioning, and build capacity in your LEA. So looking at, does your liaison need to be able to spend more time on this program? Do they need more assistance? What are other ways to build capacity for McKinney-Vento programs in a district or a charter school? Also keep in mind that under that youth risk behavior survey data that I mentioned earlier, as we look at high school students around the country, 5.4% of high school students indicated that they had experienced homelessness just over a 30-day period in the 18-19 school year. So again, that's just 30 days. If we wanted to think about the entire school year, we would have to look at a much higher percentage than 5.4%. But this is just something to keep in mind as you're thinking about your own identification and your own numbers of McKinney-Vento students. I certainly am not trying to say that if you don't have 5.4%, you're doing it wrong. You might have a lot more than that, you might have less than that, but I do think that's a very helpful and interesting touchstone to think. If we're a lot below that, maybe we need to look at our data a little bit more closely, and maybe we need to look at breakdowns of our data along racial and ethnic lines. We might be missing some of our students of color. So just kind of keeping that in mind as you think about capacity for your McKinney-Vento program and how ARP HCY funds might help you develop that capacity. So with that, I see some questions coming into the questions pane. Please keep them coming. I'm really glad to see them. We are going to get to your questions in just a little bit, so keep those coming in. But what I'd like to do now is stop talking for a little while and turn things over to our colleagues from the state of Rhode Island. So the first thing I'm going to ask Eileen Botelho and Stephanie Enos, if you would please introduce yourselves to our attendees. And then I'm going to ask you to address the two questions that you see on your slide here to sort of walk us through why you thought a needs assessment would be helpful and what elements you thought were important to include in a needs assessment. So Eileen and Stephanie, I'm going to turn it over to you for a few minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Patricia. This is Eileen Botelho. I'm the state coordinator for homeless education here in the state of Rhode Island. Rhode Island's a small state, so we also have a small SEA in terms of hats that we wear. I also work with Title I and Title IV, and I'm here on the call with my colleague, Stephanie Enos. So what I think we'll do is I'll have Stephanie introduce herself and then try to answer the first couple of questions here, and then we'll answer them together. And then I know there is another slide with questions, and Stephanie will take lead on answering those if that sounds good with you, Patricia.
That sounds great, thanks.
So Stephanie, are you there? Not sure if she's unmuted. That's what I'm trying to establish first.
Thank you, Patricia. Hi, everyone. This is Stephanie Enos from the Rhode Island Department of Education. I have the good fortune to work with Eileen. I coordinate the Title IV-A and Title I Part D programs, and we both work on Title I-A, and I support her with homelessness. So happy to speak with you all today, and thanks for unmuting me, Patricia.
Thanks. Sorry, Stephanie, my bad.
No worries.
Thanks, Stephanie. So good afternoon, everyone. It's really our pleasure, both Stephanie and I, to be invited to share with you what's happening in our state with the ARP HCY funds and what we're doing with this tool. It's been quite an innovative and creative idea, and we're really happy to share it with everybody. The first question that we're being asked here is, why did Rhode Island's Department of Education want to provide LEAs with a template needs assessment to help them guide with their ARP HCY expenditures? So the reason why we wanted to do that is because while we're a small state, we do have 66 LEAs, which seems like a lot for such a small state. That's a mixture of different kinds of LEAs. That includes urban, suburban, and charters. And although we have 66 LEAs, historically only about 8 to 10 of those LEAs have ever experienced any kind of funding to help them meet their McKinney-Vento requirements. So there's only about 8 or 10 different LEAs that have had McKinney-Vento funds and that do have familiarity with how those funds work and the allowable uses. And so we really worried, although we were very happy to get this funding, we worried that the majority of our districts were not going to really understand the best way to use it. And they were going to have, a little bit of a learning curve in terms of developing their plans. So we thought if we could develop, a needs assessment template, because obviously we want them to start with a really, careful needs assessment before they decide how to spend these funds. We thought a template would create a structure for them to work within so that they were already getting kind of a head start and kind of rein them into what the most important things are to look for when they look at their populations. We also have small districts that only have, well, actually we have quite a few districts that have under 10 in their data in terms of the number of homeless students. So naturally they wonder what's the best way with such a small occurrence to use the funding. So we're hoping the template's going to help them with that as well. So all of our districts are, do have LEA liaisons. Thankfully, they're very well trained and they're very dedicated folks, and they're really willing to learn and do the best they can for the students and the families with this money. So we thought with the tool we could help them do that. We also thought that the tool could be an excellent technical assistance tool. Even as we move into the future after these funds, we always are looking for ways to help districts with their other buckets of money, such as Title I homeless set aside or the McKinney-Vento grant. So we thought this could be a tool that could be used anytime that districts are trying to decide how to best use funds for homeless students and how to best support what they need. So what we did was we developed, or with the help of Schoolhouse Connections, 2 versions of the tool, which there's a long one and there's a short one. The short one is very much quantitative data. It's all based with data. We want our districts to use data to inform their decisions and to develop their plans. So the short version of the assessment does ask them for quantitative information and data around such things as identification, outreach, preschool students, and different topics. And it asks them different questions. And then once they answer those questions, it's really great the way it links them to resources and suggested uses. And it's just so user friendly. The longer version that some districts we know will want to use because they have larger pots of money and they have larger homeless populations also has quite a bit of quantitative data and asks additional quantitative questions, but it also then asks some qualitative questions. For example, if the topic were absenteeism on the short form, there are just 3 quantitative questions, just asking them for the data. But on the long one, it asks a couple of more, a couple of deeper questions in terms of particular buildings or grade levels. And then it goes in to ask them some qualitative things in terms of what their district does to respond to chronic absenteeism. So that should be helpful. And as I said, as they're going through the tool and working with the template, they'll be able to click on, once they answer the questions, yes or no questions, they'll be able to click on suggestions and resources that should be, very helpful to them. So in terms of the elements that were important to include in the needs assessments for us, it was that ability to link our districts right to resources and places that would really give them concrete ideas and examples of ways to do it, and they wouldn't have to go crazy looking and they wouldn't have to spend a lot of time. So we wanted it to be simple to use. We wanted it to be based in the use of data, and we wanted it to be able to connect them to resources and suggested uses of funds, that when they completed this tool, that they could look at it and then talk with their stakeholders about what they learned and about what the data is telling them is the best use for the funds. Stephanie, is there something else on these 2 bullets that you think you could add?
A great job, Eileen. I think the only other thing I'd point out is we also thought to the future with this, because I think a lot of you are working with your Title 1A funds as well. And so Patricia did a really great job for us highlighting the 10 requirements within McKinney-Vento, so that hopefully in the future we can strip down these tools and LEAs can begin to use them as these supplemental funds. If they should go away, then LEAs can still be thinking about using this data to inform their needs for homeless students.
Thanks, Eileen and Stephanie. I so appreciated the way that you were looking so strategically about how to support districts and charter schools, definitely looking longer term and sustainability. I think at the state and at the local level, you know, obviously we're hoping that these funds continue into the future. We're working for that at Schoolhouse Connection every day with Congress, but we have to be realistic that they might not extend in the future. And so how can we make the impact of these funds that we're feeling today, how can we make it so that we continue to feel that maybe over the coming years? And I think the vision that you had for the needs assessment was a really smart way to do that. What I wanted to do now is actually spend a minute just kind of very quickly sharing what this looks like. So I think Eileen did a great job describing it, but some of you might be more visual learners and might want to actually see. So let me go ahead and show you. Hopefully you're seeing this Word document on my screen now. This is the short version of the needs assessment. And like Eileen said, it's very data-based. It is short, that's why it's the short version. It's really looking at, you know, what's the FTE of your liaison. If it's lower than a certain amount, consider suggestions for how to increase liaison capacity. So it's meant to be very intuitive and very easy to use, like Eileen said. I wanted to specifically show you the identification section. So like Eileen was saying, there's a section that's really just very numbers oriented. How many students should be identifying? What about your unaccompanied youth? How's that looking? If you have a McKinney-Vento identification rate that's lower than 5.4, you know, that might be something that is a red flag. And then we also, as Eileen mentioned, have just a few additional indicators, like, are you using a housing questionnaire? Do you have brochures or posters around? And if you answer to these questions in a way that indicates that maybe you might want to look at your identification strategies and look at opportunities to improve those, then you can just click on this link, and that takes you to a document that suggests some actual ways to use ARP HCY funds to meet that need. So just the way Eileen was explaining. One thing, again, that I really appreciated about Eileen and Stephanie is that they felt really strongly that they wanted to have in these documents a reminder that there are other funds available and that ARP HCY is meant to be supplemental and not to supplant. And so as you think about sustainability, remember, you can use Title I funds to continue some of these services after ARP HCY goes away. You might want to apply for a McKinney-Vento grant if you haven't done that in the past. So I really appreciated that piece. But then we went down and just had, okay, here's some suggestions if you want to improve identification. If you are one of those LEAs that answered to the poll that I did earlier, if you were maybe only getting $5,000 or only $10,000, you don't have that much, we have some suggestions of quick and easy things you could do with small investments. And then, like Stephanie was mentioned, we also included these sort of it's the law boxes to remember that, you know, just because if ARP HCY money goes away, remember, you do have to do identification, you do have to provide professional development to school personnel. This is all stuff that you actually have to do. Now you have some extra funds to look at different ways to do it. So I'm not going to go over all of this. I just kind of wanted to show you a little bit about how this works. And I also, while I'm here with my Firefox open, I know that several of you said that you were having some trouble accessing this PowerPoint, so I'm going to actually go ahead and open it, and I'm going to click this link and I'm going to put it into the chat right now while I happen to have this open. So bear with me while I do this. Okay, I put that link into the chat. That should be working for you now. Now I want to go back to Eileen and Stephanie again. Now that you've done such a great job explaining why you wanted the needs assessment, we've given people a bit of a snapshot of what it looks at. Tell us a little bit about how is it working in practice. I know that you've done a great job at supporting your LEAs around ARP HCY funding and how to use the needs assessment. So what kind of support have you provided? And have you gotten any feedback from LEAs about how it's working, generally, challenges and successes that they're having?
Great. Thanks, Patricia. So people have context. We're kind of in the middle of our funding cycle. So what we've done at this point today is we invited Patricia to Rhode Island, and she came and presented to all our LEAs. And we did talk about those 4 buckets of funds. How do you use your Title 1A funds, the McKinney-Vento subgrants, and the 2 types of ARP funds to give people context. And then we went into the needs assessment as our first piece to say to folks, this new money's coming, and let us help you think about how you can use it as you plan towards your new year. Right now in Rhode Island, their federal funding applications for LEAs have just reopened, so we expect most of our districts will be focusing on that. And their ESSER 3 applications are due to the state by March 28th. So as those things wind down for districts, we expect them to be turning towards their needs assessments a little bit more this spring. We have heard from a few LEAs and they've started to use it, and any good tool goes with more questions. So Eileen's already fielding interesting questions we hadn't thought about yet. So what we tend to do, because we are such a small state and a team, is we come back together as a team, we brainstorm together, and then we provide one-to-one technical support to our districts. But this spring we'll also be offering, as we design the new application, our funding is going to start for July 1 for districts. So we'll be having an application webinar and provide support again for our districts, help them revisit their needs assessments, think about what their funding applications will look like, and answer those questions. So we're really trying to help them think holistically about their overall approach to supporting homeless students in their districts. And we see this as an opportunity to help those of you, especially if you work on Title I Part A, as well as these funds, you know how challenging it can be to meet those core requirements in McKinney-Vento with the limited amount of Title 1A funds together. So the more we can help districts think strategically about what they need to be doing with these funds that they haven't had in the past, we think they'll be more successful and set up for the future. So for our smaller LEAs, we expect identification and enrollment to be their largest priorities, and even see that as for some of the consortiums, because we do expect consortiums in Rhode Island, especially among the charters, that they may want to get together and pool their funds to provide richer technical assistance and supports for their frontline staff.
Thanks, Stephanie. I think the other thing, just to inform people and give context, what Rhode Island has decided to do is, with that money that we're able to hold aside at the state level and to be as efficient as possible with the funds that we have had Patricia conduct some trainings and plan to continue to do many things on a statewide basis where liaisons will get the information, and we're really hoping and encouraging them to bring that training deeper down into the school level. One of the ways that we can get stronger in Rhode Island is to have more staff at the school level, principals, teachers, transportation, lunchroom folks, everyone that interacts with kids in a building. If we could use some of the LEA level money, or encourage the smaller districts that don't have large populations to use their LEA level money to do much more training of a variety of roles of staff, that would be a good use for those that are curious and wondering, what can we do with this money if we don't have a lot of homeless students? So if we can do something state level, we're going to really try to use our state level set aside to do that. And that way there'll be less duplication of effort. Or, again, it is such a small state, and of course with the virtual meetings, it's a lot easier now for us to do state level things and get the benefit, as we're doing on this call, of nearly 200 people getting the information at once. That's one thing we've learned, that is a much more efficient way to get the message out. So the state level activity hold back, that's been a benefit to us at the SCA level, to be able to think more about broader range training with the district liaisons and staff in the central office, and then ask them to use their own LEA level allocations to do things much deeper at the school level and work with families and do much more unique and strategic things that meet the needs that they discover during this needs assessment.
Thanks, Eileen and Stephanie. I have to say, for me, I've been training LEA liaisons for a long time. And for me, I feel like it's pretty easy for me to tell at a training, what the context is by the kinds of questions that I get. Are these folks who really have not had a lot of support and this is maybe the first training they're getting, or are these people who have really been well supported and had what they needed to understand the law and the practice? And with the trainings that I've done with your liaisons, it's really been clear the kind of program that you've built in the state, the kind of support that you put in place. So in some ways, I feel like your LEAs are starting ahead of the game in comparison to some other places, perhaps, because you really have provided great training over the years and set them up for success already. So, starting from that point, and then with the needs assessment and the support you're giving them now, I think they're really set up to use these funds in a way that's going to make a real difference for students, not only now but looking into the future.
Oh, we appreciate that.
Yeah, well, it's very obvious to me, and I love doing trainings with your folks for that reason. I want to take some questions because we do have quite a few in the questions pane. We have some that have been repeated, so I can just answer them once and get everybody settled. So one question that I should have mentioned earlier: how long do we have to spend these funds? So these funds under the federal regulations have to be obligated and expended by January 30th, 2025. So it is quite a long spend down window. I know most states that I've talked to are being pretty liberal in terms of allowing districts and charter schools to amend their budgets, because what you think you need right now might look very different, even in a few weeks, never mind looking towards upcoming school years. So I think, people have to turn in a budget because that's the way funding works. But I think there's a lot of understanding about the reality of how much our situation is changing on almost a daily basis with the pandemic and other needs. So you do have some time to spend this, whether that's for personnel or for other issues. You can kind of push that out over time a little bit. There's also a question about required accountability for the funds. And actually, let me jump forward just once. Okay, here we go. Let me jump forward to this link, because at this link, you can get the Department of Education's guidance. We have an overview of it. We kind of turned it into a Q&A that's a little bit easier to read, but we also have links to the actual guidance if you want to read that word for word. And that's where you can find information about reporting requirements. They're pretty minimal based on what the Department of Ed has shared so far. It's going to be the typical McKinney-Vento data that's always collected. So looking at the numbers of students identified, achievement, absenteeism, graduation, the data that the department has been collecting for some time now. And then also looking at how many students were served with ARP HCY funds and what services were provided. And that's about the extent of the detail that we have so far in terms of federally required reporting. Now, states might have additional things that they're asking, and that's fine, but that's what we have from the federal government. All right, looking forward a little bit into the questions. I see a question: can we cover camping fees as temporary shelter assistance in cases where a motel is not available? I know that the Department of Education has been answering questions on specific allowable uses like this. They've been answering questions as they've come in, but those answers are not necessarily widely available. I can tell you that from what I've seen, I have not seen this specific question answered, but if I have to just make my best judgment based on the guidance that's been provided, I would say yes, you could, because it does say, short-term temporary shelter, e.g., as in, for example, a few nights in a hotel. So that means not exclusively a few nights in a hotel, that's just an example. And certainly I would say, temporary camping fees would be comparable to a few nights in a hotel, if that, of course, is safe and appropriate, and if that's what you have available in your community. So again, based on my reading just of the Department of Education's guidance, I'd say yes on that one. We do have a question going back to what I was saying about supplementing and not supplanting. We have a district who's planning to have an extended summer program for all students. So absolutely, your students experiencing homelessness should be able to participate in that. If they need support, whether that's through transportation, it might be through extending a personnel contract for a few weeks so that there's someone who can help connect those families and students to the program, make sure they're enrolled, make sure they're attending. That extra support could be a great use for ARP HCY funds. Okay, we have a question for, I would say for Eileen or Stephanie on this one. Who do you envision would actually complete these needs assessment? What personnel role at the district or charter school level would be going through these needs assessments?
So I would envision the homeless liaison taking lead on it, but also having to work with probably some of the data people in the district to grab some of that information on the absenteeism or other data that's being asked for. In Rhode Island, none of our liaisons are exclusively homeless liaisons in their district. They all have other hats they wear. Oftentimes it's sometimes the assistant superintendent or the curriculum director, or it's guidance people or social workers. So they would probably have to work with at least one or two other people in the district to gather the information that's going to be required to meet that needs assessment. And we do encourage input from some stakeholder groups if they could do it.
That's great, thank you. And I have a question. This might go back to you, Stephanie, because I know you were talking about the ESSER applications that some districts are working on now. Are the McKinney-Vento liaisons typically involved, if you know, in the development of the ESSER applications?
Because of the small size of LEAs, I imagine in some districts that'll be the case because you have assistant supes or superintendents who are actually your homeless liaisons. But in the larger LEAs, they may be less likely to participate. But hopefully their data is part of the overall data collection of the district.
Great, thank you for that. I have been asked to clarify that spend down window by a couple of people, so let me just make sure I'm making that clear. So that again is the deadline to obligate and draw down funds. It's January 30th, 2025. So I did say 2025, not 2024, and it is for both ARP1 and ARP2 funds. So hopefully that is a little bit clearer. And again, if you want to see some of this in writing, sometimes it's easier to, at least for me, I'm more visual. I prefer to read it than to hear it. So if you use this link on the screen, you'll be able to get all of our ARP HCY resources, including the guidance from the Department of Ed. I think they're also, I see someone saying that they were also given a deadline of September 2024. There is a different deadline for that. That might be the encumbrance deadline, but the spend down deadline is January 2025. And again, please do click on this link and read the overview of U.S. Department of Education guidance, the Q&A. The very last question in that Q&A is exactly about the spend down window. So you can get the official language from the federal regulation on that.
Yeah, and Patricia, just to jump in on that, because we've had that question internally in our organization, the difference could be what the LEA's date is versus the state's date, or
Great.
where that,
yeah.
fiscal processing is.
I appreciate you mentioning that because I know there are a number of areas where states have some additional requirements that the federal government doesn't have, and so that's really important to know. What is your state doing? Let's see, a couple other questions coming in. If a local LEA is using ESSER funds for summer enrichment, can ARP HCY funds be applied to provide transportation to McKinney-Vento students who would otherwise not be able to attend? I think that could be a great use for ARP HCY funds. Now, just remembering the supplement, not supplant piece, if your district is providing transportation for other students to attend with other funds, then they should do the same thing for your McKinney-Vento students. But I know oftentimes for summer programs, transportation might not be provided. And so you could certainly use ARP HCY to help your students get there. I think that's a great idea. I have a question here. Has Schoolhouse Connection considered putting out a universal McKinney-Vento eligibility form that states can use? One of the biggest issues in my state is that there's not a single form that can collect data from families about trying to find out eligibility as well as needs and determining needs for the families. So Schoolhouse Connection, we have not developed a universal eligibility form. However, I do kind of keep a collection of them myself, and I have a couple that are my favorites, and I'd be happy to send those out if people want to drop me an email and just send me an email and say, send me your housing questionnaire or your eligibility questionnaires, and I can send you a couple of my favorites. There's one from New Hampshire, actually, that I like a lot, and one from Miami-Dade County in Florida. Not to pick favorites, but those are just a couple that I thought were very user-friendly and helpful. So I'd be happy to send those to you. Just drop me an email. Here's I think a really interesting comment for all three of us, Eileen, Stephanie, and myself, and probably mostly this is my bad, so I'll take this on me. But was there any student or parent input into developing the needs assessment? And I really didn't consult with youth or with parents on it, which is something that I usually do. So that's an oversight on my part. I wonder, Eileen and Stephanie, do you have any thoughts about getting parent or student input on the needs assessment and any ways that that might have made some changes? Or maybe that's something we can do sort of for a round two.
Yeah, so we didn't do it only because I think where our mind was in terms of why we were doing this was that we were trying to educate the staff in those districts that weren't familiar with the allowable use of McKinney-Vento funds about what they were or about what some of the ways they could use it and things like that. So I think that we were at such a beginning stage. It's always good to get parent input and student input, but we were at such a beginning stage with familiarizing our districts that hadn't had these funds before as to what they were and how they could be used, that we tried to fashion all the questions around moving them in that direction. I'm not sure how student or family input might have helped districts with their needs assessment to design programs, and with the quick time frame, I didn't want to do anything to put a barrier to the completion of the needs assessment as well.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I know that in several places in the allowable uses of funds, so as people go through the needs assessment and they click on, oh yeah, I want to do better in identification, and it takes them over to the suggestions of how to use funds. In many places, we did include ideas for, hiring students and parents to help you with outreach, to help you develop flyers and develop social media postings, and, ask the youth and the families, what kind of language would resonate with you? What kind of language might be intimidating or might just not make sense to you? We want to avoid that, but help asking actually students and parents to help design posters, flyers, social media, web page information even, and then actually hiring those folks as well to help put that information out in the community. So help us know where to hang the posters, help us know where to put the brochures. So I know we definitely tried to include a lot of those suggestions for districts to do that, even though we didn't actually do it on our end at this particular level.
But
Let's
I do.
see.
Patricia,
oh yeah, go ahead, Stephanie.
I'm sorry. I was going to say, but I do wonder moving forward if we look at this as what is the living streamlined version. If we were to move it to that iteration when the ARP funds are gone, then getting parent and family feedback at that point, potentially.
That's great. And we did have someone commenting as well saying that, quick turnaround and specific goals could make that stakeholder engagement process more difficult. And I think that's definitely getting back to exactly what Eileen was saying.
No, I was out on Thursday and Friday.
So I think I've gotten through most of the questions. Please keep your questions coming in if you have any. What I'm actually going to do now is I'm going to go off book for a second here. I just want to show you that ARP HCY page that I mentioned, and I want to go ahead and open up that guidance because we're having a lot of questions coming in around the spend down window. So this is the ARP HCY link that I provided on the PowerPoint. We have these things called ARP HCY Spotlights, where we're talking about what different districts are doing with their ARP HCY funds in particularly innovative ways. So if you want to talk to us about what you're doing with your ARP HCY funds, we would love to highlight you. You can email Karen Rice on our team and let her know what you're doing with your funds. But
Patricia, you can see that one of our districts made it onto your page, so we were quite pleased. If you scroll back up, you'll see our Middletown, Rhode Island district made it to your page, so we were really pleased to be spotlighted for that.
Fantastic. Well, like I said, we love what you're doing in Rhode Island and love to highlight you. And, we don't want to play favorites. So please send in what you're doing. It may be that, we haven't reached out to ask because we haven't done a good job at that, but please let us know. But I didn't just want to do a commercial. I actually wanted to, here we go, show you the U.S. Department of Education's guidance. This is the Q&A that we made of the guidance. We have the links here to the exact guidance if you want to go ahead and take a look at exactly what the Department of Ed put out. But what I wanted to do was go down to that very last question that I promised you we had here. So this is, again, this is from Section 421B of the General Education Provisions Act. ARP, it's kind of a long answer, but the bottom line is until January 31st, 2025. So the funds are available statutorily through September of 2023, but this federal statute here from JIPA extends the timeline till September 2024, but then you also get an additional 90 days for drawing down and expending funds after that September 30th date. So when you add all that together, that's how you get to the 2025 deadline. But as Stephanie mentioned, it's a good idea to talk with your business office and check with your state coordinator as well, just to see if any of these deadlines might be a little bit different in your state. These are the federal requirements here. So with that, I'm taking a quick look in the questions pane. I don't see any more questions that have come in. Eileen and Stephanie, I want to give you an opportunity for any last words, any advice that you might want to share with any of the attendees, whether they're from the local level or the state level, or any thoughts that you want to share with them before we sign off.
We just want to thank you again for having us. It was really a pleasure for us to be able to share what's happening in our little state of Rhode Island and some of the successes that we're having. And as everyone on this call we feel very grateful to have these funds. This is such important work that is so terribly underfunded, and our districts struggle and grapple every day with how to do what they know they need to do with no funding. So it's really nice to be able to deliver some good news that we have some funding and help them direct it into the places where it can do the most for students. So it's a lot of new work for us, and I know everyone's in the same predicament. And I think that's a little bit of the problem with our districts. They're overwhelmed with so many different wonderful new funding opportunities that it's hard for them to put all their energies into any one because they're spread so thin. And we're really happy to come on this webinar and show you the tool, and we really appreciate the guidance that Patricia's given us and the support from Schoolhouse Connections. And Stephanie, did you have anything to add?
No, just thank you for the opportunity, and we're happy to be here today. So thank you for that.
Well, thanks, Stephanie and Eileen. Like I said, we have worked together for many, many years. I always enjoy working with you, and the way that you and your LEAs are rising up to this challenge. Because like you said, Eileen, it seems silly to say, hooray, we have unprecedented 10 years worth of funding in 1 year for McKinney-Vento, and it's so great. But at the same time, we're also exhausted and don't really know what to do with it, and everything is just kind of happening at once. So it is a challenge at the same time as it's a blessing. And so any way that Schoolhouse Connection can help provide support, we absolutely want to do that. So with that, I want to thank everyone who participated today. Like I said, if you had any trouble with the handouts, you will be getting an email that will provide you with a link to those. So you should get those, no problem. And I just appreciate you taking the time to be with us today, particularly given how very, very busy you all are and just the myriad of challenges that schools are facing right now. I appreciate all of the work that you all are doing every day for students and families. So personally, I want to thank you all. And professionally as well. Thanks for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day.